Hello, everyone, and welcome to our office hour with Chief Programs Officer Benjamin Feist. I am Michaela Sharp, the Communications Assistant here at the ACLU of Minnesota, and we really created office hours as a way to answer your questions through comments, DMs, and word of mouth about your rights during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's program will cover really what the role of the ACLU is during this challenging time. Government transparency and accountability, how the ACLU is still doing work to protect people in prisons, jails, and immigrant detention centers, and threats to public privacy and public health surveillance programs. And without further ado, I introduce Benjamin Feist.
Thanks, Michaela, and thanks to everybody who's tuned in today. Today is very exciting. It's my first time back in the ACLU of Minnesota office in Minneapolis. It's completely empty except for me, which is weird, but I'm happy to be back here. I think it's been about a month and a half, so yay for that. So as Michaela said, my name is Ben Feist. I'm the Chief Programs Officer here at the ACLU of Minnesota. And in that role, I coordinate and oversee all of our programs activities through the organization. So that includes our legal activities, policy, and community engagement and organizing. And part of the idea behind this position is to be able to strategize ways to use integrated advocacy with all of these different tools to work on the ACLU's priority civil liberties issues and really use the power that we have here in Minnesota to push things forward. So I feel really honored and privileged to be in this position where I have been for just about a year. Prior to that, I was the legislative director here for 6 years. So I have some expertise about the Minnesota Legislature and how things work there. Yeah, and in general, I'm sort of a jack of all trades because I get to see all of the amazing civil liberties work that we do across the board. And so that makes me dangerous enough to have opinions about everything, but maybe not all of the details. So we'll see how this goes.
Nice. So I want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question, please comment below and we'll try to get to them in the program. And I'm just going to start right now. And the first one is, sometimes it feels like we work and we organize for change and nothing ever happens. Coronavirus is in our prisons, jails, and detention centers. Black people are dying from the disease at sky-high rates. Families with mixed immigration status are being denied economic relief. What can the ACLU of Minnesota actually do to move us closer to equity and justice right now?
That's a heavy-hitting question to start us off with. So thanks for that, Michaela. No, seriously, a really great question. And first off, I want to acknowledge that the state of Minnesota can be a really great place for people to live and have a great experience. But unfortunately, that really stops if you're white. We have seen terrible racial disparities in our state when it comes to the criminal legal system, education, housing, employment, and other areas as well. And so we really, here at the ACLU, really understand the need to look at these issues that are impacting Minnesotans through a racial equity lens and understand that COVID is hitting certain communities harder than others, and that tends to be the most marginalized historically here in our state. The ACLU is in a fantastic position, I think a very unique position, to be here addressing COVID-19 today because we have the opportunity to lift up impacted voices and to organize and use people power. We also have legal and policy expertise that we can take to the courts and to different levels of the government to try to really push for change. So I think that is really a wonderful place for us to be right now, and we're doing everything we can to respond in this moment. And I gotta say, I'm so thrilled with the way that everybody in this organization has stepped up during the time of crisis, and we're really doing some of our best work ever right now.
Thank you. And then on the same vein, the COVID-19 pandemic is both a public health crisis and an economic crisis. The ACLU of Minnesota is not a public health organization, nor is it explicitly an economic justice organization. Given that, what is the ACLU's role in our response to COVID-19?
Right. So I think the ACLU Minnesota has a really important role to play right now, mostly because what we're seeing is major government action that's happening right now. And this means that the ACLU is watching all of these actions that are coming out by the governor, by our legislature, by the courts. And we are in a great position to be reactive to what we see going on there. And again, using that expertise in all of our resources and connections. We also are in a great position because we work in those spaces already to have a really strong voice to let the government know which ways that they could come in and actually make things better for people during this time of crisis. So we've been really active in reaching out to a lot of different government actors to try to get things moving at the same time that we're challenging other things that are going on in court.
Yes, and if you want to see anything about the work that we're doing on a daily basis, check out our COVID-19 response timeline on our website. And also, if you're just tuning in, make sure to drop your questions below in the comments. And now we're moving on to issues of government transparency. The ACLU of Minnesota called for government transparency in an op-ed in the Star Tribune. Can you explain what's going on with the legislature? Don't we have open meeting laws that prohibit our elected officials from meeting behind closed doors like this?
I'll start with the first general question, what's going on at the legislature? And, frankly, our legislature is grappling with COVID-19 and this new reality, just like all of us are. And unfortunately, especially in the immediate aftermath in the middle of March, what we saw was really a complete lack of transparency at the Capitol. Things started off this session really pretty great for the ACLU of Minnesota pre-COVID. We had a bunch of priority issues that were getting attention at the Capitol. We were having hearings on our priority bills, and things were moving along just great. And then all of a sudden, the door felt like it was slamming shut by our legislature with the need to social distance and focus all of their attention on COVID-specific bills and issues. And while that is understandable, they went about it in a way that really kept a lot of people out of the process. Not just the lobbyists and the interested individuals who are always up at the Capitol, but really decisions started happening behind closed doors where a majority of the legislature itself really had no input into a lot of things that were going on until they were being asked to vote on this by the leaders of both parties in both the House and the Senate. And that basically meant that all this decision making on amazingly important issues to the state of Minnesota during this crisis was worked out without any meaningful input by anyone except a select handful of folks. We actually saw this happen at the end of last session as well when they were running into deadline times. And we just had the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the Senate, and the Governor making a lot of these decisions. So that's disheartening from people who really care about the process. And it has really created a not accessible space for people who want to see what's going on in our government during this important time. I'll jump back in then to the question about the open meeting rules. We do have laws about that in Minnesota. And unfortunately, what we saw is that there are ways around that by only having working groups. So small groups of legislators that don't have to actually fall within the parameters of a true open meeting as a way to get around having to be public and transparent with what was going on. So we understand that we can't really be fully safe just knowing that we have open meeting laws. So we need to be more demanding, I think, in having a strong open government in our state.
Yes, and even if the meetings take place behind closed doors, aren't there public records that can be requested to make sure all those closed door discussions and conversations were done ethically and within the rules of government?
Thanks. I think the answer to that, whether we can expect to ever get documentation about what happened, I don't know. Part of the problem is that we can make public records requests, but we'll never really know what happened there. We won't necessarily know everybody who was in the room, how things transpired, especially if all that we get is a one-page agenda with a list of items that were going to be part of the discussion, and they didn't bother to record what was happening in that meeting. So I'd like to say that, yes, we have the ability to make these data practices requests here in Minnesota, and we can be effective with those, but we shouldn't have to at the end of the day. I think that's a really extreme ask of everyone in order to just understand what's going on with our government.
On that topic of what is going on in our government, do the ACLU's recent calls for government transparency and accountability mean that the organization supports calls for Minnesota to reopen?
We haven't taken any position on the general proposition that our state needs to reopen all businesses and go back to normal activities. That's really something that public health experts need to be focusing on and advising the governor on, not the ACLU. We are not experts in that area, and we don't pretend to be. I think the important thing when we talk about government transparency and accountability is that this process needs to be as open as possible given the circumstances. And just today, actually, I was watching a Zoom hearing of the House Public Safety Committee. And Zoom is, we're on Zoom right now, Michaela and I, and Zoom has been really helpful to get people connected, and it's allowed business and folks to continue to do what they need to do. But you have to remember there's a lot of accessibility issues with Zoom as well. People who don't have access to a strong internet connection, perhaps are folks dealing with various disabilities. Traditionally having the opportunity to go into our state capitol, which is a very open place, and be seen, see and be seen in that place and have a voice, just an opportunity not to try to navigate technology to make a public comment, but to really just raise your hand when they say, is there anyone in the audience who wants to be heard on this topic? You can just walk in and be part of that process. You can also corner legislators immediately after they vote and ask them why they made the decisions that they did and call them out as a constituent or a concerned citizen. And that is not something that you have any access or ability to do when you are seeing legislators from their kitchen tables, listening to hearings and making votes and decisions.
Nice. We got a question from the Facebook comments, and I'm going to read it right now. And it is, what are some suggestions for how the legislature can be more transparent?
That's a really good question. And, I think I would, if I had the ability, I would defer to my great policy director, Julia Decker, who I'm sure has given this a lot more thought than I have. But I think at minimum, the legislature needs to get better about scheduling out the work that it's going to do, making sure that copies of bills are available to the public before it comes up, so that there's enough time to really react, and to also offer perhaps more flexibility for folks who want to be involved in this process, instead of just feeling like it's a secondary thing to see if anyone can jump through the hoops to provide testimony.
Thank you for that question, whoever was out in the audience. So now we're going to move to the topic of public health and what does that mean? I've heard a lot of talk about public health surveillance as a measure to fight the spread of coronavirus. What exactly is public health surveillance?
Well, I think generally when the term public health surveillance is used, that it's a pretty broad term for the fact that we have these kind of armies of epidemiologists out there who need to be able to monitor disease outbreaks and track what's going on throughout the country, throughout the world, and here in Minnesota as well. And so they're looking at trends and data and trying to accumulate that and use it to create these predictive models that you hear about. So it sounds a little scary anytime you put surveillance in the title there, but when looked at that way, I think we all understand that this is an important function for public health right now. I have a feeling we're going to get some questions here about the more surveillance-y part of that, so I will let you ask.
Yes. So just in general, what has the ACLU heard about the government's plan to conduct public health surveillance in Minnesota? What are the ACLU of Minnesota's concern about data collection and public health surveillance during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, so far, we really haven't heard a lot of detail about what to expect when the government starts to reopen more. We have concerns based in large part on speculation that we've heard in other places, and also by looking around the world at what other governments have done. There are some pretty privacy intrusive things that have happened in South Korea, in China, and some other places that don't necessarily have the same history of privacy rights and the value that Americans and Minnesotans really put on their privacy rights. I think privacy has always been one of the ACLU issues that has appealed to me because there's such a strong, truly bipartisan interest in this topic. And we have champions at the legislature and in other arenas on this issue that add a lot of nuance to the debate. So our concerns tend to be that government overreach seems almost inevitable. The more that you open the door and let the genie out of the bottle for mass surveillance, the harder it's going to be to try to rein that in going forward. Government, and in particular law enforcement, has a pretty terrible track record here in Minnesota when it comes to rolling out new technologies without vetting it with the people first and making sure that there's public buy-in and an understanding of exactly what this data is going to be used for, what type of warranted or unwarranted surveillance is going to happen. And it puts everybody in this sense of like sort of a dystopian or Orwellian situation here, where we have mass surveillance of all of our movements, who we're associating with, what places of worship we go to, which hospitals we visit. The list goes on and on. So we're getting this really sensitive personal data, and now potentially health data, one that we protect even more in Minnesota. And what kind of protections are there going to be for that data, even if it's being used on the front end for a legitimate purpose? And how do we know that it's going to be deleted after the appropriate amount of time? And how do we know that it won't be used for some other purpose by the government going forward? So just in broad brush, I think that those are the main concerns that we always have with government surveillance and technologies. Every year there's something new at the legislature, and I wish they would move faster, because maybe we would have a sense of security, that the government wasn't going to start using drones, for example, for mass surveillance just to see where people are going. We've been working on a bill for 6 years to try to stop that practice and make sure you have a warrant first before law enforcement uses a drone. But that's currently pending right now because there hasn't been an emergency to get the legislature active. So we'll see what happens here.
On the topic of your data and government transparency, we got a question from Diana Peterson. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. She said she heard this morning that Citizens Council Freedom is gathering signatures on a petition to oppose the Minnesota state government proposal to authorize all hospitals to share all patient data records with the state, whether or not the state patient consented to it, and whether or not the patient has been diagnosed with COVID-19. Diana said she signed the petition. This is a horrible threat to our privacy. Has the ACLU heard of this proposal, and what is the ACLU's position on this?
We actually just heard about this within the last couple of days as something that could be coming up in the legislature. And so we were very quick then to take a look at this and start analyzing it. Again, I'm the one who kind of farms out the project. And so I don't know the ins and outs of that particular proposal. But what I can tell you is that, similar to the person asking the question, we have a really strong gut reaction to the idea that our personal medical data will be used for any purpose that we don't consent to. Minnesota, again, has a really strong history of being, in fact, more protective than other states and the federal government when it comes to medical privacy. And there are quite a few champions of that principle at the legislature. So as this goes forward, it will absolutely be something that we're paying close attention to, vetting that fully, and then again, taking a position when we know a little bit more. But we're at least going, at minimum, we're going to keep a very, very close eye on that.
Yes, thinking about the close eye. I read something about a potential partnership between the federal government and private companies like Clearview AI to use facial recognition tools for public health surveillance. Is that something we really need to worry about?
Yes. Short answer is absolutely. Clearview AI is a super creepy company. If anybody wants to look them up, in general, what I can say about that is that they tend to market a technology to law enforcement where they can do facial recognition over all of these different public sorts of video footage that you could get from street cams or outside of businesses or even inside of businesses that don't have facial recognition, and basically overlay that facial recognition. And then they even say that they are able to connect up that data with social media accounts and other types of digital stuff that's out there about people. So we're very concerned about any type of contracts that this company would start having with the state of Minnesota. We're already aware that they apparently have done some work with the University of Minnesota. I don't have a lot of detail about that, but that was already on our radar coming into this. And what it really comes down to is that anytime there are these new technologies, our position is that there may be really positive public reasons to utilize the technology, and that we are not anti-technology as an organization. What we want to make sure, though, is that the issues have been fully brought out and vetted through a process of either the legislature or through city councils or somewhere where before all of this happens and it's rolled out and it's this nightmarish situation for the people of Minnesota, people have had an opportunity to really look at what privacy they're willing to give up and to sign off on. And my guess is that if you see how truly creepy some of this stuff is, a lot of Minnesotans would not be comfortable, in fact, with the government getting involved in this sort of thing. So yeah, we're going to be watching very, very carefully to see if anything happens with Clearview AI or any other type of company like that.
Thank you. And if you just joined us or if you've been here for a while, we're going to transition to questions about COVID-19 and prisons and detention facilities. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below and we'll try to get to them. So here's the next question. It is, how is quarantine affecting people being held in ICE custody or who are in jail or incarcerated?
Well, what we know right now is that people who are detained are scared. They're very worried about their situation because there is no way to social distance in those quarters. And their families are concerned, and understandably so. People who are working there should also be concerned because this isn't just about the folks who are incarcerated. If there's a major outbreak, which arguably there already has been in Moose Lake, the people working there can take it back to sometimes small communities that may not even be resourced enough to have the hospital systems that would be needed to deal with these major outbreaks. So, there is a lot of fear there. The question was in part about ICE facilities. And I think the answer there is we don't have a lot of data right now to even understand if there's testing going on there. And if so, what the results have been. But we haven't heard anything specifically, unfortunately, without really dire situations. It has been very difficult to get the government or the courts to take these issues seriously. So instead, we have the situation like we do in Moose Lake, where we have filed a lawsuit. And if you were paying attention last week's program, you heard from our legal director, Terry Nelson, about that lawsuit in a little bit of depth. But in that case, we're seeing this outbreak hit every unit of the facility. So there's nowhere safe to go. And they have responded by putting people into segregation, solitary confinement, which is basically seen as a punishment. So the idea that is a way to save people by putting them in solitary confinement is just morally repugnant, in my opinion. So we continue to have a lot of work in this area and a lot of concerns, as do the people who are there.
Yes, and this is a question from the audience. Shout out to David. But he really wants to know, what are we doing to address COVID-19 in jails and prisons? You mentioned Moose Lake, so where are we this week with that current development? He said, it seems the restrictions on congregate living that are applied to nursing homes should be applied to prisons and jails. Otherwise, prisons become hotspots for the coronavirus, as you said.
Yeah, great question and commentary there. As I understand it right now, we still see up to 5 people in a cell in Moose Lake, despite the fact that we have this pending lawsuit. And I could, as an update there from last week, we very recently heard that the judge in that case issued an order, a show cause order, that is basically saying that when you look at the allegations in our complaint, it's apparent that the government has not met its duty to mind the health and safety of the people who are incarcerated there. And the government is now required to respond and basically explain themselves as part of this lawsuit. And that, I think, has happened, or they have until May 11th, unfortunately, to respond to that. So while I think that was a step in the right direction from the court, and we can be happy with that result, the fact that we are pushing this back all the way to May 11th, and then it will have another hearing after that as well. It's really disheartening that we haven't seen quicker action from the court when we know that at any point this outbreak could reach just terrible, terrible proportions. So that's sort of the good and bad news of what's happening there. Oh, I can also, just to jump back in, we're also really excited to announce that we in 34 organizations just sent out a letter and a draft executive order to Governor Walz to really encourage the governor to take a stand and use his authority to get people released sooner. You know, it's very specific categories of people. So a lot of different things would have to apply, but you know, we've done the hard work in putting together the executive order that is really ready for him to sign off on. So it is our hope that with the pressure that the ACLU and all these other community organizations are bringing to the table here, that we could get some action that would really move things forward at a faster pace, because the courts just aren't getting there fast enough.
Thank you. And on that note, we get a lot of comments about, well, you can't just let people run free if they are in jail or in prison. So what really, from the executive order that we released, outlines our criteria for who gets released because of coronavirus?
Yeah, I don't have the details in front of me, but as a general understanding here, we're talking about really vulnerable populations first and foremost. So elderly people, people with pre-existing conditions that make them more susceptible, and people who are not going to be there much longer anyway. Also, we're talking about folks who are in there just based on a technical violation. So you know, they had a technical violation of their parole or probation, and that was the only thing that sent them back, not actually committing a new crime. So we have all these different categories of people, for one thing, and that, you know, part of this is we're also saying that we're not just opening the door and letting people out. You know, we have to be able to show that people have a place to go, and that essentially they would be able to shelter at a residence for the time being. And so if they have more time to serve, they're still going to have to deal with some of that sentence going forward. But this is really just a way to preserve the safety of everyone during the crisis.
Thank you. And another, just can you explain a little bit more about technical violations? Like, what is a technical violation?
Sure. You know, this is something we've had a lot of concern about for many years, because we've seen in Minnesota that the pipeline for folks going back to prison, to jail, is really filled up with folks who have been released for something and are back in the community, and then do something to slip up with their probation officer. So this could be anything as simple as failing to make an appearance one day because maybe you have childcare issues, or there could be, again, a host of reasons that you don't meet one of these basic conditions. So it's really a punitive thing to say that we are going to send you back just because you couldn't follow everything exactly as was set forth in the terms of the probation and parole. So we've been doing a lot of work before COVID to try to get some reforms in this area so that we have really a more humane system that takes other things into account and tries to use going back to prison as really a last resort instead of something that we continually see funneling through our system.
Thank you. Thank you. And if you have any questions or comments, please put them below. This is the last call. And again, if you comment and we don't get to it today, we'll be doing this every Thursday at 4:30. So we'll get to your question later. So to round it out, what can people do from home to help the ACLU of Minnesota's work to reduce the population of prisons, jails, and detention centers during COVID-19?
Great question. And I think the short answer is you can do a lot from home. As we're seeing now, we're all working from home and seeing amazing results from that. So people should feel really empowered during this time, I hope, with the amount of things you can do if you set your mind to it, even when you are stuck home. So I guess the first thing is, support the work of the ACLU by staying in touch through Facebook, through Twitter, and through our website. We are always creating great content through our communications team, Michaela and her associates, doing a wonderful job of putting that out there, because I think everybody needs to see what's going on, what you can get plugged into. You can become better informed on the issues, and then you can really raise your voice and use that people power, because we really recognize, especially as an organization that uses this integrated advocacy model, that we need to have our members and supporters and the great civil libertarians of Minnesota out there taking to the streets when needed, but also just coming, being a participant in events or contacting your legislator, keeping in touch with your elected officials who make important decisions about this stuff all the time. That's something that you can be doing now. We'll have action alerts and petitions and other things that you can do. And we really do hope to keep everybody engaged. And we really do appreciate the support that we get from everybody. And we hear the concern that's going on throughout the community right now. So hopefully we can work together and continue to do this great work. And I hope to be able to offer even more going forward.
Thank you, Ben. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who tuned in today or may tune in later on in the future. We do this work because you all have comments, you have questions, you have concerns, and we want to make sure that we're listening to them. And furthermore, thank you to the members and the donors. We could not do this work without you. You make it so that we can do Zoom calls with each other and go into the office and keep doing the work that's really important to vulnerable populations and for other Minnesotans. Tune in next Thursday. We will have another office hour, and the focus will be on immigrant rights and immigrant detention, and also the census. And that, I have a little secret, may or may not be in Spanish. So, thank you so much for joining in today, and thank you, Ben, and have a great night.
Thank you, Michaela. Take care, everybody.